My wife threw me out in the rain on a Tuesday night in October, and I watched from the curb as our 14-year-old daughter stood at the window of the second floor, her face pressed against the glass, watching her father load garbage bags into the trunk of a 2011 Corolla while water ran down the back of my neck. The bags were heavy, my work boots, my thrift store clothes, a box of books I'd been reading to kids at the non-profit where I worked for $41,000 a year. My wife was on the porch, her voice cutting through the rain, telling me she was done carrying a man who couldn't provide, done pretending we were fine when the mortgage was 3 months behind, and our daughter wanted to go to Spelman, and we both knew there was no money for that. What she did not know, what she would not know for 5 more months, was that I owned the building she was throwing me out of. Free and clear, along with 9 others across Hyde Park and Bronzeville. A portfolio worth $9.2 million built on money she never knew I had, from a lawsuit she never knew I won, paid out under an agreement that said I could never tell her where it came from. I let her believe I was broke. I let her pay bills I could have covered 10 times over. I let our daughter feel ashamed of the car I drove and the lunch I packed in Tupperware. Before you assume you know where this is going, stay with me, because what happened that night was not about money. It was about whether the man you think you married is the man standing in front of you, Wanti, and what happens when you find out you never knew him at all. My name is DeAndre Simmons, and this is the story of how I lost my wife by trying to save myself. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds longer than I needed to. The rain had soaked through my jacket, and one of the garbage bags had split open, spilling my work shirts across the sidewalk. I could have bent down to pick them up. I didn't. Brittany was still on the porch, arms crossed, waiting for me to say something. Anything. I had 1,000 words in my chest and no way to get them past the knowledge that none of them would matter. Kennedy's face was still pressed to the glass upstairs. Our daughter, 14 years old enough to understand that her parents were breaking apart in front of the whole block, young enough that she'd carry this moment with her for the rest of her life. I opened the Corolla's trunk and started loading what I could salvage. The car was 12 years old, a 2011 model with 182,000 miles on it. The check engine light had been on for 3 months. It ran fine. That's what I always said when Brittany asked why I didn't just buy something newer. It runs fine. She stopped asking 2 years ago. You're really not going to say anything? Brittany's voice cut through the rain. She sounded exhausted, more than angry. That was worse somehow. I closed the trunk, looked up at her. She was wearing the charcoal suit she'd worn to court that morning, the one she bought when she made junior partner at Sidley Austin. It cost more than I told her I made in a month. What do you want me to say? I want you to fight. Her voice broke on the last word. I want you to care that your family is falling apart. I want you to act like any of this matters to you. A car pulled up behind mine. A black Lincoln Navigator with vanity plates that read Jameson. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Harold, Brittany's father, retired Cook County Circuit Court judge. The man who'd spent the last 10 years making sure I understood exactly how much of a disappointment I was to his daughter. He got out slowly, the way men his age do when they want you to know they're still capable of authority. 68 years old, 6'2", wearing a wool overcoat that probably cost what I made in 2 weeks at Bright Futures. He walked past me without acknowledgement and climbed the porch steps to stand next to Brittany. You all right, baby girl? Brittany nodded, didn't look at him, kept her eyes on me. Harold turned to face me then. His expression wasn't anger. It was something colder. Vindication. You know what your problem is, Dre? He didn't wait for me to answer. You're comfortable being small. You found a job that lets you feel good about yourself without actually having to provide for anyone. And my daughter's been covering for you for so long, she forgot what it feels like to have a partner. I could have told him the truth right there. Could have explained that the building they were standing on belonged to me, that I'd paid cash for it in 2014, that the mortgage Brittany had been covering for 3 years was one I'd set up specifically so she'd feel like she was contributing, because I knew if she found out she wasn't needed, she'd ask questions I couldn't answer. Instead, I said I should go. Yeah. Harold's voice was flat. You should. I got in the Corolla. The interior smelled like the coffee I'd spilled last week and the lemon air freshener that had been hanging from the rearview mirror since Kennedy bought it for me in 5th grade, Father's Day gift. The string had frayed and the lemon had faded to yellow-white, but I'd never taken it down. I pulled away from the curb slowly, checking the mirror one last time. Brittany had gone inside. Harold was still on the porch, watching me leave. Kennedy was gone from the window. The rain followed me south down Kenwood, through Hyde Park, past the university buildings and the bookstores and the coffee shops where Brittany and I used to go when we were young and broke and convinced we'd figure everything out together. I drove to Bronzeville and checked into the Reliance Motor Inn on 43rd Street. $48 a night, weekly rates available. The clerk was a young brother, maybe 22, who looked at my face and didn't ask any questions. The room was on the 2nd floor, single-bed particle board dresser, television bolted to the wall, bathroom with tiles that had probably been white in 1987. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my phone. The lock screen was a photo of Kennedy at 3 years old, gap-toothed and laughing, sitting on my shoulders at the lakefront. Brittany had taken the picture. I remember because she'd said it was the happiest she'd ever seen me. I set the phone face down on the nightstand. You're still listening? Thank you. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. This story goes deeper than you think. To understand how a man ends up owning $9 million in property while his wife thinks he's broke, you have to go back to the beginning, back to before Brittany, before the money, back to a classroom in Evanston and a paper I wrote about Frederick Douglass that a professor decided I was too poor and too black to have written myself. I was 22 years old when Professor Richard Halloway called me into his office after seminar and told me I'd written something too good to be mine. It was February, senior year. I was 3 months from graduating Northwestern with a degree in African American Studies, full scholarship, honors track. I'd spent 4 years proving I belonged there, 4 years walking past students whose parents donated buildings while I worked the overnight shift at the campus library to send money back to Grandma Rose in Englewood. 4 years being the only one in most of my classes who looked like me. The paper was on Frederick Douglass, specifically on the rhetorical strategies Douglass used in his 1852 speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, and how those strategies anticipated the arguments of the civil rights movement a century later. 32 pages, 47 citations. I'd been working on it since October, meeting with Halloway every 2 weeks to discuss my progress. He'd seen my drafts. He'd offered notes. He'd told me it was strong work. 3 days after I submitted the final version, I got an email from the Dean of Students' office, not a request for a meeting, a summons, the kind of email that uses the word immediately twice in 3 sentences. I walked into that office at 2:15 on a Thursday afternoon and walked out at 2:43 with no degree, no scholarship, and no explanation that made sense. The dean, a woman named Patricia Morland, sat behind her desk with a printed copy of my paper and a printout from some database I'd never heard of. She said a section of my analysis matched passages from an obscure academic text published in 1998. She said Professor Halloway had flagged it. She said the university had a zero-tolerance policy on academic dishonesty. She said I was expelled effective immediately. I tried to explain that I'd never seen the text she was referencing, that my drafts were on my laptop with timestamps going back 4 months, that Holloway had reviewed every stage of my work. She said the evidence was clear. She said I could appeal, but the decision would stand pending investigation. She said I had 24 hours to vacate my campus housing. I called Grandma Rose from the Burger King on Sheridan Road because I couldn't afford to waste the minutes on a long call from my cell. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said 4 words. "Come home, baby, now." I moved back to Englewood that weekend, back to the 2-bedroom house on 63rd and Honore, where Rose had raised me after my parents died in a car accident on the Dan Ryan when I was 9. Back to the neighborhood I'd spent 4 years trying to prove I'd moved beyond. I got a job at the UPS distribution center on Pershing Road, loading trucks from 4 in the morning until noon, making $11 an hour. I came home and slept until Rose got back from her shift at the hospital where she worked as a home health aide. We ate dinner together. We didn't talk about Northwestern unless I brought it up. She let me carry it quietly. It took me 8 months to save enough to hire an attorney. His name was Marcus Webb, a solo practitioner with an office above a beauty supply store in Chatham. He charged me $3,000 to file a formal appeal with the university and request access to the investigation records. He said it might take a year. He said not to get my hopes up. It took 5 years. 5 years of legal motions and university stalling and discovery fights. 5 years of me working at UPS, then moving to the night shift so I could make $13.50 an hour. 5 years of Grandma Rose telling me to let it go, and me not being able to. Because it wasn't about the degree anymore. It was about the fact that a man looked at my work and decided I was too poor and too black to have written it. And I needed someone to say that out loud. I needed it in a document with a seal. The breakthrough came in year 4. Marcus subpoenaed my laptop and had a forensic analyst examine the file metadata. The drafts I'd written predated the publication of the text Holloway claimed I'd plagiarized. The passages weren't even similar once you read them side by side. The analyst found something else, too. Holloway had a pattern. Over 12 years, he'd accused 7 students of plagiarism. 6 were black. 5 had their accusations quietly dismissed after they'd already been expelled or suspended. None had pursued legal action. Northwestern's general counsel called Marcus in October of my 27th year. They wanted to settle quietly, no press, no public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no apology, just money and a non-disclosure agreement that meant I could never speak publicly about what happened, could never name Holloway, could never tell anyone the amount I received. The offer was $8.7 million paid in 3 installments over 3 years. I sat in Marcus's office above the beauty supply store and stared at the settlement documents for 20 minutes before I signed. The first installment was $2.9 million, deposited into an account I opened that afternoon at a Chase branch on 79th Street. I drove home and found Grandma Rose in the kitchen, seasoning a pot roast for Sunday dinner. Gospel was playing low on the radio. She looked at me and knew. "They paid?" "Yes, Mum." She wiped her hands on her apron and sat down at the table. I sat across from her. The money felt like a weight I didn't know how to carry. "What you going to do with it?" she asked. "I don't know." She reached across and took my hand. Her fingers were rough from 40 years of lifting patients and changing sheets and doing work that mattered more than it paid. "Money's a magnifier," she said. "It makes you more of what you already are. You were a good man when you had nothing. Don't let having something turn you into somebody else." I met Brittany 6 months later, during the lawsuit years. Back when I was still just a man trying to prove he'd been wronged. Back when both of us were broke and hungry and convinced we'd build something beautiful together. I met Brittany 3 years into the lawsuit, back when both of us were broke enough that a date meant splitting a pizza at Giordano's and walking the lakefront because we couldn't afford the movies. She was in her second year at University of Chicago Law. I was 24, working the UPS night shift and living in Grandma Rose's house, still carrying the weight of being expelled from a school I'd earned the right to finish. She didn't ask too many questions about Northwestern. I told her I'd left for family reasons, which was true enough. She told me her father was a judge, which made me assume she came from money. I was wrong. Harold Jameson had worked his way up from public defender to the bench over 30 years, and he'd done it the hard way. Brittany grew up watching him leave the house at 6 in the morning and come home at 9 at night, building respectability, one case at a time. We got married when I was 24 and she was 23, 6 months before her law school graduation. Small ceremony at Greater Emmanuel Baptist in Englewood, Grandma Rose's church. 40 people. Brittany wore a dress she bought at a consignment shop in Hyde Park. I wore a suit Harold loaned me because I couldn't afford to buy one. The reception was in the church basement with a sheet cake from Jewel and chicken from Harold's Hickory Pit, the barbecue place on 75th that had been there since Harold was a kid. Brittany was happy. So was I. We were building something together, and neither of us had anything except the belief that we'd figure it out. The first settlement check arrived 7 months later, $2.9 million deposited into an account only I could access. I told Brittany the lawsuit had settled. I didn't tell her the amount. When she asked, I said it was enough to cover my legal fees and give us a cushion. She didn't press. She was studying for the bar and working part-time at a legal aid clinic. She trusted me to handle it. I bought the first property 3 weeks later. A brick 2-flat on Cottage Grove in Bronzeville, 14 units, seller financed for $320,000. I paid cash. Set up an LLC called Simmons Holdings with a registered agent address at a UPS store in Chatham. Hired a property manager named Lorraine Matthews, a woman in her 50s who'd been managing buildings on the south side for 20 years. She handled everything: rent collection, maintenance, tenant issues. I told Brittany I was doing some consulting work to help pay down debt. The second installment came 2 years later. Another $2.9 million. I bought 3 more buildings in Hyde Park and 1 in South Shore. Brittany had passed the bar by then and was working as an associate at a mid-size firm downtown, making $52,000 a year. We moved into a small apartment on 53rd Street. She asked if we could afford it. I said yes. She didn't ask how. By the time the third installment arrived, I owned 8 buildings. The portfolio was worth $6.4 million and generating $41,000 a year in net rental income. I was 27. Brittany was 26 and pregnant with Kennedy. I finished my degree at Chicago State, took the job at Bright Futures Literacy Project making $41,000 a year, and told Brittany I wanted to do work that mattered. She supported it. Back then she still believed we were building slowly, carefully, the way poor people who'd made it out were supposed to build. She didn't know I'd already built it. She didn't know the foundation was poured and the house was standing, and all I was doing was deciding whether to turn the lights on. Harold started in the year Kennedy was born. We were at his house in Chatham for Sunday dinner, him and Brittany and me, and Brittany's mother, Diane, who worked as an administrative assistant at the county clerk's office. Diane had made pot roast and green beans and macaroni and cheese, and Harold was holding Kennedy, 2 months old, talking about what kind of man she'd need to see at the head of the table when she got old enough to understand what provision looked like. Brittany could have married a doctor, he said, not looking at me. Could have married a partner at a firm, someone with ambition, someone building something. Brittany told him to stop. He didn't. Over the next 10 years, Harold's voice became the metronome that marked time in our marriage. Every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering where he'd find a way to let me know I wasn't enough. "You still at that non-profit, Dre?" "Kennedy's school costs $32,000 a year. You know that?" "A man who can't provide isn't a man. That's not opinion. That's fact." I never argued, never defended myself. Just sat there and let him say what he needed to say, because the truth was more complicated than he could see, and I couldn't explain it without breaking the NDA that had come with the money. Brittany's career took off. She made junior partner at Sidley Austin when Kennedy was 8, started pulling in $280,000 a year. The gap between what she made and what I made became a canyon. She started going to firm events alone, started declining to mention what I did when her colleagues asked, started introducing me as someone in property management instead of saying I ran a literacy non-profit that served kids in Englewood. The breaking point came the summer Kennedy turned 11. Brittany's law school friend Simone was getting married to a man named Marcus Chen, a tech executive who'd sold a startup for $30 million. The wedding was in Napa, vineyard ceremony, 4-day weekend. Brittany came home with the invitation and asked if we could go. I looked at the cost: flights, hotel, rental car, wedding gift, maybe $3,000 total. I had buildings generating $52,000 a month. I said we couldn't afford it. "Why not?" "We need to save. Kennedy's tuition, the mortgage." She stared at me. Something shifted in her face, something small but permanent. "I'll pay for it myself," she said. She went alone. Flew out on a Thursday, came back on a Monday. She didn't talk much about the trip. Just unpacked her suitcase, went back to work, and started moving through the house like someone who'd seen a life she was supposed to have and realized she'd married into the wrong one. 3 years later, she went to her 10th law school reunion. Same pattern. She asked if I wanted to come. I said I had to work. I didn't. I had a meeting with Miss Lorraine about a roof repair on a building in Hyde Park, but I could have rescheduled. I chose not to. Chose to let Brittany go alone, again, to stand in a room full of people who'd become what they'd promised themselves they'd become, while I stayed home, pretending to be someone I wasn't. She came home late that night and went straight to bed. I stayed up in the living room. Kennedy, asleep upstairs. The house quiet except for the sound of my wife not asking me why I'd chosen, once again, to let her carry us alone. The truth is, I could have told her any time. Could have walked her through the bank statements and the property deeds and the trust I'd set up for Kennedy's education. Could have explained that every time she covered the mortgage, I was letting her. Not because I needed her to, but because I didn't know how to let her in without admitting I'd been lying by omission for 14 years. But by then, the architecture was set. The house was built, and I was just a man standing inside it, watching my daughter grow up ashamed of me and my wife grow distant, wondering if the thing I'd been protecting was worth what it cost to protect it. Kennedy was 11 when she started lying about what I did for a living. I found out by accident. Parent-teacher conference at University of Chicago Laboratory Schools, Kennedy's 6th grade year. Her homeroom teacher, a woman named Ms. Patricia Holloway, mentioned how nice it must be that I worked in property management and could set my own schedule. I didn't correct her, just nodded and said it had its advantages. Kennedy was sitting between me and Brittany, staring at her hands. In the car afterward, Brittany asked Kennedy where Miss Holloway got that idea. "I don't know. She must have assumed." "Did you tell her that's what your father does?" Kennedy looked out the window. Her voice was so small I almost didn't hear it. "Maya's dad works in property management. He drives a BMW. I just said Dad does something similar." Brittany glanced at me in the rearview mirror. I was sitting in the back because Kennedy had called shotgun. The look on Brittany's face wasn't anger. It was something worse. Recognition. Like she'd just realized our daughter had inherited her shame. The humiliations piled up slowly, the way erosion happens. Not all at once, but grain by grain, until you look up one day and realize the foundation has shifted. I drove a 2011 Corolla with 182,000 miles on it because it ran fine. The check engine light had been on for 8 months. The passenger side mirror was held on with duct tape. Kennedy's friends' parents drove Teslas and Audis and Range Rovers, cars that cost more than I made in a year at Bright Futures. When I picked Kennedy up from school, she started asking me to park around the corner. Why? I just want to walk. It's nice out. It was February, 19 degrees. She walked 3 blocks in the cold so her friends wouldn't see her get into my car. I packed lunch in Tupperware containers. The same blue Rubbermaid set Grandma Rose had bought from the dollar store on 75th Street 20 years ago. I'd bring them to work, wash them in the break room sink, bring them home. Brittany started buying disposable containers from Whole Foods, the kind that came in packs of 20 and cost $12. She'd pack Kennedy's lunch in those, never said why, didn't have to. The clothes came from Goodwill and the Salvation Army on 53rd. I'd find Oxford shirts that still had the department store tags, khakis that had been dry cleaned once and donated. Brittany stopped doing my laundry, started asking me to keep my work clothes in the basement, said the detergent I used made her sneeze. When Kennedy turned 12, Brittany stopped inviting me to firm events. Holiday party at the Drake Hotel, partners and spouses only. She went alone, came home at midnight, took off her heels in the foyer, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the lights. "How was it?" I asked from the doorway. "Fine." "Meet anyone interesting?" "Everyone asked where you were." "What did you tell them?" "That you had to work." She drank half the glass in one pull. "They asked what you do." "I told them you run a literacy non-profit." One of the senior partners said that must be rewarding. His wife asked how we afford Kennedy's tuition on a non-profit salary. "What did you say?" "That we make it work." She finished the wine, stood up, walked past me without looking at me. They pitied me, Dre. I could see it on their faces. I told her I was sorry. She said she was tired. We didn't talk about it again. Kennedy's 8th grade class trip to Washington, D.C. cost $1,100 per student. Brittany paid for it, didn't ask if I wanted to contribute, just wrote the check and handed it to Kennedy to turn in with her permission slip. I offered to split it. Brittany said it was handled. "I want to help." "You do help. You show up. You're present. That's enough." It wasn't enough. We both knew it. But she said it anyway because the alternative was admitting that 14 years into our marriage, she'd stopped expecting me to be able to provide anything except presents. Kennedy asked her mother once why I didn't care about money. I wasn't supposed to hear it. I was in the kitchen making dinner. Kennedy and Brittany were in the living room, and Kennedy's voice carried through the doorway the way children's voices do when they think adults aren't listening. "Why doesn't Dad care about money?" Brittany was quiet for a long time. Then, "Your father cares about different things." "Like what?" "Like helping people, like making sure kids who don't have much get a chance to read, like being a good person. But we need money too, for my school, for the house." "I know, baby." Does he know that? Another long silence. Then Brittany's voice, barely audible. "I think he does. I think he just doesn't know how to care about both." I kept cooking, stirred the pot of spaghetti sauce Rose had taught me to make with crushed tomatoes and garlic, and a pinch of sugar to cut the acid. Set the table. Called them in for dinner. We ate together like a family. Nobody mentioned the conversation. Kennedy asked about homework. Brittany talked about a case. I washed the dishes while they watched a show in the other room. Saturdays I tutored at Bright Futures, free sessions for kids who needed extra help, mostly 4th and 5th graders from Englewood and Auburn Gresham who were reading 2 or 3 grade levels behind. I'd get there at 9 and leave at 2, come home tired and satisfied, the kind of tired that feels like you've done something that matters. Brittany hated it. Not the work itself, but the fact that I did it for free. That I had time and energy for other people's children while our daughter was growing up ashamed of me. Harold told her she was enabling a man-child. She started to believe him. The marriage became an architecture of avoidance. 2 people living in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, raising the same child, moving around each other like furniture. She stopped asking about my day. I stopped asking about hers. We'd sit at dinner, Kennedy between us, the sound of silverware on plates filling the space where conversation used to be. December of Kennedy's freshman year, Brittany had her firm's holiday party at the Four Seasons. She bought a new dress, black and elegant, the kind that cost what I made in a month. She got her hair done at a salon in River North, put on the perfume she saved for special occasions, the one that smelled like vanilla and something I could never name. She looked beautiful. I told her so. She said thank you without smiling. "You're not going? Do you want me to?" She adjusted her earring in the hallway mirror. "I want you to want to." "I do want to." "No, you don't. You want to stay home and avoid the questions about what you do and how we manage and why you're still driving a car that's older than our marriage." She picked up her clutch. "It's fine. I'm used to it." She came home just after midnight. I was awake, reading in bed. She took off her heels, hung up her coat, changed into one of my old T-shirts she'd claimed years ago, got into bed and lay on her back, staring at the ceiling. "Good party?" "Same as always." We lay there in the dark, not touching, the distance between us measured in inches and years. I could feel her thinking, could feel the weight of everything she wasn't saying pressing down on the room. "You married the wrong man," I said. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was careful, measured, the voice she used in depositions. "I married the man you were. I don't know who you are anymore." I wanted to tell her, wanted to explain the buildings and the trust and the reason I'd chosen this life, wanted to lay it all out and let her decide if the man I was had been worth the man I'd pretended to be. But the words wouldn't come. They never did. She fell asleep first. I stayed awake watching her breathe, wondering when the last time was that we'd both wanted to be in the same room at the same time. The secret almost came out once. If it had, everything might have been different. But that's the thing about secrets. They survive right up until the moment they don't. And you never see the moment coming until it's already past. Kennedy was 13 years old when she found the folder in my desk. It was a Tuesday in February, 8 months before Brittany threw me out. Kennedy was doing homework in my home office, a converted sunroom at the back of the house that looked out onto the small yard where I'd planted tomatoes every summer since we moved in. She was looking for a stapler, found a manila folder instead, one I'd left in the second drawer down, underneath a stack of old Bright Futures newsletters and a binder full of student progress reports. The folder was labelled Simmons Holdings LLC in my handwriting, black Sharpie, clean block letters. Inside were property deeds, tax assessment documents, and a 2-page asset summary from Miss Lorraine, dated January 15th. 10 properties listed, addresses in Hyde Park, Bronzeville, and South Shore. Total assessed value, $9.2 million. Kennedy didn't understand what she was looking at, but she knew it was important. She took a photo of the summary page with her phone. Then she brought the folder to me in the kitchen, where I was making dinner. Spaghetti again? The sauce was simmering on the stove, filling the house with the smell of garlic and tomatoes and the basil I'd grown last summer and frozen in ice cube trays the way Rose taught me. "Dad, what's this?" I turned from the stove. Kennedy was holding the folder out to me, her face caught between curiosity and something else. Confusion, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. I took the folder, set it on the counter, stirred the sauce once to buy myself time. "Where'd you find that?" "Your desk. I was looking for a stapler." She watched my face. "Is it important?" "It's something Grandma Rose left me before she passed." Not a lie, not exactly. Rose's house on 63rd Street was one of the 10 properties. The first one I'd owned outright, the place I'd grown up, the 2-bedroom bungalow where she'd raised me after my parents died. I'd kept it exactly as she left it, rented it to a family from the church for $800 a month, half what I could have charged. Everything else I'd built around it. "Are we rich?" Kennedy asked. The question hung in the air between us. The sauce bubbled. Gospel played low on the kitchen radio, a station Rose used to keep on all day. I turned the heat down under the pot. "We're comfortable. But we don't live like we're rich, because money changes people. It makes them forget what matters." Kennedy nodded slowly. Processing. She was 13. Old enough to know our car was older than her friends' cars. Old enough to see her mother stress about bills. Old enough to feel the gap between what we had and what we looked like we had. But young enough that my answer seemed to satisfy something in her. "Can I tell Mom?" "You can tell her whatever you want." She took the folder with her when she left the kitchen. I heard her feet on the stairs. Heard her bedroom door close. Heard the muffled sound of her voice through the walls, probably calling one of her friends. I turned the heat off under the sauce. Sat down at the kitchen table. Waited. Brittany came home an hour later, got out of her work clothes, changed into leggings and one of my old Northwestern T-shirts back from when I still had school pride, before the expulsion, before everything. She came downstairs and found me still sitting at the kitchen table, the sauce cold on the stove, the pasta water not even started. "Kennedy showed me some papers." "I know." "Why didn't you tell me?" "It's not something I wanted to make a thing about." She pulled out the chair across from me. Sat down. The folder was in her hands. She'd been reading it. I could tell by the way the pages were rearranged, the way she'd dog-eared the asset summary. "This says you own buildings worth almost $10 million. The assessed value isn't the same as what they're worth. Most of them need work. The income covers maintenance and property taxes. It's not life-changing money. It's more money than I make in 3 years. It's tied up, in property, in tenants, in repairs. It's not liquid." She looked at me for a long time. Tired. So tired. She'd worked 12 hours that day, probably. Left the house at 7, got home at 8, carried us financially for years while I did work that mattered to me, but didn't pay enough to cover what a junior partner at Sidley Austin thought we needed to spend. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because Rose left it to me to manage. Not to spend, not to live off of, to keep and pass down to Kennedy when she's old enough to understand it. It was the best version of the truth I could give her without breaking the NDA, without admitting that Rose's house was just one piece of something much larger, something I'd built with money Brittany didn't know I had. The lie was thin enough that she could see through it if she wanted to. She didn't want to. How much income does it generate? Enough to help. Not enough to change how we live. Another lie. The buildings generated $52,000 a month in net rental income after all expenses. $624,000 a year. More than twice what Brittany made. more than 15 times what I made. Money I funneled directly into a trust for Kennedy's education and our retirement, money that would mature when Kennedy turned 25, money that would pay for Spelman and medical school and a house and everything else my daughter would need to build a life where she never had to feel the weight of financial insecurity the way Brittany and I both had. Brittany had been covering bills she didn't need to cover: the mortgage, the car payments, Kennedy's tuition, groceries, utilities, insurance, everything. She'd been doing it for years, believing she had to, believing I couldn't, believing she'd married a man who'd chosen principle over provision. I let her believe it. "Okay," she said finally, closed the folder, set it on the table between us. "Okay." That was all. She didn't ask to see the bank statements, didn't ask about the property manager, didn't ask how Rose, a home health aide who'd made $13 an hour for 40 years, had accumulated enough real estate to be worth millions. She was too tired to dig, too tired to fight, too tired to care about the architecture underneath the surface. She told Harold 2 days later. I know because he called me, asked if I wanted to grab a beer. We met at a place in Chatham, a sports bar near his house. He ordered a Bud Light. I ordered a Coke. "Brittany mentioned you got some property from your grandmother." "A few buildings, nothing major." "That's good. Real estate's solid. Long-term wealth building." He drank his beer, watched the Bulls game on the TV above the bar. "You managing it yourself?" "I have a property manager." "Good, good." Another drink, eyes on the screen. "You know what you're doing with it?" "I'm learning." He nodded. The Bulls scored. The bar erupted. Harold waited for the noise to die down before he spoke again. "Even that, he'll probably lose." He said it to his beer, not to me, but I heard it. The dismissal, the judgment, the certainty that even this modest inheritance from a woman who'd worked her whole life would be too much for me to handle. That I'd mismanage it, squander it, prove once again that I wasn't capable of building or keeping anything of value. I finished my Coke, thanked him for the beer, drove home to a house I owned and a wife who was paying the mortgage on it because I'd never told her she didn't have to. 8 months later, she threw me out in the rain. I sat in the sanctuary of Greater Emmanuel Baptist Church on a Wednesday afternoon in November, 1 month after Brittany threw me out, and tried to pray. The church was nearly empty. Just me and 2 older women in the front pew, Sister Harris and Sister Matthews, both of whom had known Grandma Rose for 40 years. They didn't acknowledge me, didn't turn around, just sat there whispering to each other while gospel played soft through the overhead speakers, the same songs Rose used to hum while she cooked Sunday dinner. This was where Rose brought me every Sunday after my parents died, where she taught me to sit still and listen for something bigger than my own voice, where she held my hand during my father's funeral and told me that grief was just love with nowhere to go. I'd been coming here my whole life. Stopped after Rose passed. Started again the week after Brittany put me out. I'd been living in a studio apartment in Bronzeville, 600 square feet above a dry cleaner on 47th Street, $450 a month paid in cash to a landlord named Curtis Williams who didn't ask questions. I still worked at Bright Futures, still drove the Corolla, still packed lunch in Tupperware. The only difference was I came home to silence instead of distance. Kennedy was angry at both of us. I knew because my lawyer told me. Brittany's lawyer and my lawyer had worked out a custody arrangement. Every other weekend, Wednesday dinners, holidays split down the middle like we were dividing assets. Kennedy had refused to see me the first 3 weekends. Brittany didn't force it. Neither did I. I sat in the pew where Rose used to sit, 3rd row from the back on the left side, and stared at the cross above the altar. The question I'd been carrying for a month sat in my chest like a weight I couldn't shift. Tell her or let her find out. Break the NDA and explain everything or stay silent and let the architecture speak for itself. The NDA was clear. I couldn't discuss the settlement publicly, couldn't name the professor, couldn't disclose the amount. But it didn't say I couldn't tell my wife privately. It didn't say I couldn't explain to Brittany why I'd chosen what I'd chosen. I could break it, pay whatever penalty came, finally be seen for who I actually was instead of who I'd let her believe I was. But Rose's voice was in my head, the way it always was when I needed it most. Something she told me when I was 16, right after I got my acceptance letter to Northwestern. We were sitting in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd later tell me that money was a magnifier. She was making Green's gospel on the radio, and I'd asked her if she thought I was ready for college. "The truth don't need your permission to be true," she'd said, not looking up from the stove. "It'll come out when it's supposed to. Your job is to be ready when it does." I'd been carrying that for 22 years, turned it into a philosophy, turned it into a shield, used it to justify every choice I'd made to stay silent, to let Brittany believe what she believed, to build a life on a foundation she couldn't see. I'd told myself I was protecting something, protecting her, protecting us, protecting the integrity of what money meant and didn't mean. But sitting there in that church, I knew what I'd really been protecting myself. My right to be misunderstood, my right to feel righteous in my humility, while my wife and daughter lived in the shadow of a lie I'd built and called principle. I pulled out my phone, called Miss Lorraine. She answered on the second ring. "Mr. Simmons?" "The building on Kenwood, the one we've been talking about selling. I want to move forward." Silence on the line. "Then you sure?" "Yes. It'll take about 3 months to close, maybe 4. I'll need to send notices to all the tenants, including your wife." "I know." "She'll see your name on the documents." "I know." Another pause. I could hear papers rustling on her end, the sound of her moving through her office, pulling files, already working. "The buyer's a community development non-profit," she said. "They're offering current tenants first right of purchase at $340,000. That's $85,000 below market rate. Your wife qualifies as a tenant since her name's on the lease as co-occupant." "That's fine." "You want me to give her a heads up? Call her before the letter goes out?" "No, let it come through the normal process." "All right." More rustling. "I'll start the paperwork. Expect notices to go out in January, Liz. Sale should close by late March." I thanked her, hung up, sat there for another 20 minutes while Sister Harris and Sister Matthews finished their prayer and walked past me toward the exit. Sister Harris touched my shoulder as she passed. "Your grandmama was proud of you," she said. "Don't forget that." I nodded, couldn't speak, watched them leave. The sanctuary was empty now except for me and the gospel still playing through the speakers. A song Rose loved. "His eye is on the sparrow," about being held even when you can't see the hand holding you. I stood up, walked down the center aisle, pushed through the double doors into cold November air. The wind cut through my jacket. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Kennedy. First one in 3 weeks. "Mum says I have to see you this weekend. I don't want to." I stood there on the church steps, the phone in my hand, reading the text 3 times. I could have called her, could have tried to explain, could have asked for a chance to sit down and talk. I didn't. Just put the phone back in my pocket and walked to the Corolla parked at the curb. I'd made my choice. Not to chase Brittany with explanations. Not to beg Kennedy to understand before she was ready. I'd let the truth arrive on its own terms, the way Rose said it would. If Brittany was meant to see the foundation I'd built, she'd see it. If Kennedy was meant to understand why I'd done what I'd done, she'd understand. I'd stopped trying to control what people thought of me, started trying to accept what I'd become in the pursuit of staying invisible. It took 5 months for the truth to find her, and when it did, it didn't come from me. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late March, 5 months after I moved out. Brittany came home from the office at 7:30, kicked off her heels in the foyer, and saw the envelope on the hall table where Kennedy had left it. Certified mail. Return address, Kenwood Community Holdings, LLC, care of Lorraine Matthews, Property Management, 79th Street, Chicago. The envelope was thick, professional, the kind of correspondence that meant something was changing. She opened it standing in the hallway, Kennedy upstairs doing homework, the house quiet except for the sound of paper tearing. The letter was 2 pages, single-spaced, typed on letterhead with a watermark. Standard legal language, notice of pending property sale. Current tenants being offered first right of purchase at $340,000, $85,000 below assessed market value, 60 days to respond. If declining purchase option, 60 days to vacate. The signature line at the bottom of page 2, DeAndre R. Simmons, Managing Member, Simmons Holdings, LLC. She read it once. Stopped. Read it again. Her hands started shaking somewhere around the third read. She set her briefcase down, walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of water she didn't drink, came back to the hallway, picked up the letter, read it a 4th time like the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. She went upstairs to her home office, the room we used to share before I moved my desk to the sunroom because she needed space for case files. She sat down at her laptop, opened Chrome, typed Simmons Holdings LLC Chicago into the search bar. The Cook County property records loaded first. 10 addresses, all residential buildings, 4 flats, 6 flats, small apartment complexes, Hyde Park, Bronzeville, South Shore. Assessed total value, $9.2 million. Owner of record on every single deed, DeAndre R. Simmons. Purchase dates, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, the year we got married, the year Kennedy was born, the years I was supposedly broke and building slowly and doing consulting work on the side. She clicked through to the tax records, each building generating rental income. Total estimated annual net revenue after expenses, $624,000. More than twice her salary at Sidley Austin. More than 15 times what I made at Bright Futures. She sat there staring at the screen. The numbers didn't move, didn't change, just sat there in Arial font, black text on white background, telling her that every mortgage payment she'd made for the last 12 years, every tuition check, every car payment, every stressed conversation about money, every fight about vacations we couldn't afford, and Kennedy's school trip and whether we could handle the property taxes, all of it had been performance. Theatre. Her carrying weight I'd never needed her to carry. She opened a new tab, pulled up the firm's legal research database, logged in with her partner credentials. Searched DeAndre Simmons, Northwestern University, settlement. The case was sealed, NDA attached, but the classification code was visible, the university's name, the case number, and the settlement range indicator, $5 to $10 million. She closed the laptop, stood up, walked to the bathroom, looked at herself in the mirror, junior partner, $280,000 a year, 14-hour days, a marriage she'd worked herself sick trying to hold together, a husband she'd thrown out because she thought he'd given up. And the whole time, the whole goddamn time, he'd been standing on a foundation she couldn't see. She called me. I was at Bright Futures, Tuesday afternoon, 4:15. I had a 6th grader named Jamal sitting across from me at one of the reading tables, working through a book report on The Giver that was due the next day. Jamal was from Englewood, lived with his grandmother, reminded me of myself at that age. Serious kid, quiet, carried more than he should have had to. My phone rang. Brittany's name on the screen, first time she'd called me directly in 5 months. Everything else had gone through lawyers. I answered. "Hey, is this real?" Her voice was shaking, not angry yet, just shaking. I looked at Jamal, held up one finger, stepped into the hallway outside the reading room. "Is what real?" "The letter, the buildings, the company, your name on the deed, all of it." I leaned against the wall, closed my eyes. "Yes." "How long?" "Since we got married." "You've owned these properties since we got married?" "Yes." Silence. I could hear her breathing, trying to control it, failing. Why? It was the only question that mattered. Why I'd let her pay bills I could have covered. Why I'd let Kennedy grow up ashamed. Why I'd let Harold spend a decade telling me I wasn't enough. Why I'd chosen silence over partnership. Northwestern expelled me my senior year, false plagiarism accusation. Took me 5 years to fight it. The settlement came with an NDA. I couldn't talk about it. Couldn't tell anyone the amount. When the money came, I made a choice. I'd build security, but I wouldn't let it define me. I'd keep doing the work that mattered. And you never thought to tell me? I thought about it every day. But you didn't. No? Why? Her voice broke on the question. Why would you let me think we were struggling? Why would you let me carry everything? Why would you watch me work myself sick, trying to hold us together when you had this the whole time? I didn't have a good answer. The real one, the true one, was too complicated and too simple at the same time. Because I was afraid she'd see me differently. Because I didn't trust her with the choice I'd made. Because I'd turned Grandma Rose's wisdom into armor and used it to keep everyone out, even the people I loved most. I got that money because they tried to destroy me, I said. Because a professor looked at my work and decided I was too poor and too black to have written it. I wasn't going to let it destroy me a second time by making me into someone I'm not. I'd rather be the man making 41,000 who owns the block than the man making 400,000 who sold his name for it. Silence. Long enough that I thought she'd hung up. Then her voice, barely audible. How long have you been lying to me? I never lied. I just never corrected your assumptions. She laughed, sharp, bitter. That's the same thing, Dre. Maybe it was. Probably it was. I'd spent 16 years telling myself there was a difference between lying and letting someone believe something false. Standing there in the hallway at Bright Futures, hearing my wife's voice crack over the phone, I couldn't remember why I'd thought the distinction mattered. Yeah, I said. Maybe it is. She hung up. I stood there holding the phone for a minute. Then I went back into the reading room. Jamal was still working on his book report, pencil moving across the page in careful block letters. He looked up when I sat down. "You good, Mr. Simmons?" "Yeah, Jamal, I'm good. Let's see what you got." Brittany sat in her office on the 23rd floor of the Willis Tower, windows overlooking the Loop, the city spread out below her like a promise she'd spent her whole life trying to earn. She cried for 20 minutes. Then she wiped her face, printed out the property records, put them in a folder, got in her car, drove south to Chatham. The truth didn't fix anything. It just changed what we were fighting about. Brittany didn't come back, not right away, not for 4 months. She was angry that I'd lied by omission for 16 years, angry that she'd paid bills she didn't need to pay, angry that she'd felt poor when we weren't, angry that Kennedy had grown up ashamed. But mostly, I think, she was angry at herself, for not asking harder questions, for accepting my explanations. for letting her father's voice drown out her own instincts about who I was. We stayed separated. I kept the studio in Bronzeville. She kept the Victorian in Hyde Park, bought it from me at the $340,000 non-profit rate, her name on the deed for the first time in her life. Kennedy split time between us, weekends with me, weekdays with her mother, holidays negotiated through lawyers like we were dividing assets instead of trying to salvage a family. Kennedy was furious at both of us, at her mother for throwing me out, at me for letting her believe we were struggling. She didn't say much for the first 2 months, just moved between houses with her headphones on, door closed, teenage silence thick enough to cut. Then one Saturday in June, she showed up at Bright Futures. I was running the summer reading program, 20 kids from Englewood and Auburn Gresham, ages 8 to 13. Kennedy walked in at 9:30, stood in the doorway watching me work, with a 4th grader named Destiny, who was still reading at a 2nd grade level. Kennedy didn't say anything, just sat down at one of the empty tables, pulled out her phone, stayed for 3 hours. She came back the next Saturday, and the one after that, started helping the younger kids with their reading logs, started eating lunch with them, started asking me questions about the work, about why I did it, about whether it mattered. I watched her watch me teach a kid to decode a word he'd been stuck on for 5 minutes, watched the light come on in both their faces when the word finally clicked, and I realized she was seeing me clearly for the first time. Not as the father who drove the old car, not as the man who couldn't provide, just as someone doing work that mattered to him, with or without an audience. Harold came to see me in July. Showed up at my apartment in Bronzeville on a Thursday evening, no warning, knocked on the door like he was serving papers. I let him in, offered him a seat on the futon that doubled as my couch. He sat, looked around at the 600 square feet I'd been living in for 9 months, didn't say anything for a long time. "Brittany told me everything," he said finally. "I figured. You should have told her years ago." "I know. You should have told me." "Why? So you could judge me for having money instead of judging me for not having it." He flinched. That landed. He sat there with it for a minute, working his jaw like he was trying to decide whether to walk out or stay. "You made her feel small," he said. "You made her carry weight you could have carried. You let her think she was the only one holding the family together. That's cruel, Dre." "I don't care what your reasons were." He was right. I knew he was right. Didn't make it easier to hear. "You made her feel small because you needed to feel big in your humility," he continued. His voice was quiet now, steady. The judge voice. "You needed to be the righteous man making 41,000 while secretly owning 9 million. You needed that story more than you needed her to be your partner. That's not integrity. That's pride." I looked at him. 68 years old. Spent his whole life building respectability. Spent 10 years telling me I wasn't enough because I reminded him of every fear he'd ever had about not being enough himself. "You're right," I said. He nodded, stood up to leave, stopped at the door. "For what it's worth," he said, not looking at me, "I was wrong about you. I'm sorry." He left. I sat on the futon for an hour afterward, staring at the wall, understanding for the first time that an apology and forgiveness weren't the same thing as reconciliation. That being right about my wealth didn't make me right about my choices. That Grandma Rose's wisdom about truth not needing permission had become my permission to withhold it. Brittany called me in August, asked if I wanted to get coffee. We met at a place on 53rd Street, halfway between her house and my apartment. Sat outside, talked for 2 hours. She didn't apologize, neither did I. We both knew Sorry wasn't big enough for what we'd done to each other. Could we try again? She asked. Different this time? Honest. Therapy, shared decisions, no guarantees. Yes, I said. We started slow. Saturday coffee became Saturday lunch. Lunch became co-parenting conversations that didn't end in silence. We talked about Kennedy, about therapy, about whether the marriage was something we both still wanted or something we were holding on to because we'd invested too much to let go. I offered to buy her out of the Victorian so she could start fresh somewhere else. She said no, said she wanted to make it hers, wanted to build something that was actually hers from the foundation up. I understood that, signed the papers, watched her become a homeowner at 37, same age I'd been when I bought my third building. Let me tell you something about secrets. They're not the same as privacy. Privacy is choosing what you share and when you share it. Secrecy is building a wall and calling it protection. I told myself I was protecting Brittany from the weight of the money, protecting Kennedy from growing up spoiled, protecting myself from becoming someone I didn't want to be. But really I was protecting my right to be misunderstood, to feel righteous in my humility while everyone around me felt the absence of something they couldn't name. You can't love someone fully if you won't let them see the whole foundation you're standing on. You can't build a partnership on silence and call it integrity. You can't ask someone to trust you while withholding the context they need to understand your choices. That's not sacrifice, that's control. My wife saw my name on the landlord's note, but the real question was whether she'd ever see the man who signed it, whether I'd let her, whether I was brave enough to be known instead of secretly right. It's Saturday afternoon in September now. Kennedy and I are sitting on the steps of Bright Futures after tutoring. Harold dropped off BBQ from his spot on 75th. We're eating out of styrofoam containers, sauce on our fingers, the late summer heat starting to break. You gonna keep the Corolla? Kennedy asks. I look at her, 14 years old, starting to look like her mother, starting to sound like herself. It runs fine, I say. She laughs. First real laugh I've heard from her in a year. The sound fills the space between us, warm and unexpected, and I understand that this, right here, is what I should have been building toward all along. Not the architecture of hidden wealth, the architecture of being seen and choosing to stay. Anyway, that's the end of the story. We're not fixed, we're not whole, but we're here, and that's something